Welcome to About Writing. I'm your host, Ben Cheever, and today we have a frequent guest, Andrew Blauner, with an astonishing and very powerful book, In Their Lives, Great Writers on Great Beatles Songs. Talk to me about why you came up with this idea and why now.
Well, like so many things. First of all, thanks for having me back. This is just a joy every couple of years. And the last time I was here, we were talking about the Bible, and I thought that was going to be my last one because what better book to go out on? What's bigger than the Bible?
The Koran.
Well, what as Lennon sort of famously, infamously said,
we're bigger than Jesus Christ.
I believe it's just sold more records than. I mean, the Beatles were part of my childhood. It's part of my family lore, and it just transcended and stayed with me. And so when I was casting about, because I did want to do another one, but not something that didn't move me. And you know, we're having this sort of Beatles moment now. There's the 50th anniversary of Sgt. Pepper. There's the Beatles channel, which is launching next week, I think, on Sirius. But it's kind of always it's a perpetual Beatles moment. And so I just thought if I could sort of do what I do, which is sort of stitch together this tapestry of voices and pieces of people sort of coming at a topic that's near and dear to me, but from different perspectives, then maybe that's something worth trying to do.
And it turns out that it's very powerful, and yet it's a little dizzying. I think you even felt that too, because everybody, the Beatles were like, they belonged to everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, Dylan belonged to some people, but there were other people who really didn't like him. The Beatles just are in the earth.
That's a great way to put it. I mean, the fallacy is you're either a Beatles fan or a Stones fan, and that you're a John or Paul, and it's not really that.
No, you're a Beatles
simple.
fan. You may also be a Stones fan.
Or you may just love one song, or you may not realize that all you need is love that you hear people quote comes from a lyric, or come together, or it just cuts across and kind of democratizes things. I mean, you could have people on both sides of the political spectrum or for different backgrounds, and I think like baseball, like certain subjects that can just kind of
more widespread than baseball, I think.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I worked at a school in California briefly. Worked is the wrong word. Called the Learning Place, and it was an awful school. But every morning when we started, we would play "Here Comes the Sun" and dance around.
I mean, I've been to 2, if not 3, weddings when the bride came down the aisle that they played "Here Comes the Sun." It's, as you say, it's just sort of part of our lives. And the title of the book, In Their Lives, is a riff on arguably my favorite, which was In My Life. And these are sort of mini memoirs by 28 writers writing about songs that are either their favorites or that had some personal meaning to them. But you're right, it's dizzying. It's sort of like, I mean, kaleidoscopic. I mean, obviously there was the sort of...
Yes,
right.
That's right, and the whole... acid phase of our lives, the
not my life, but their lives, and I was
and my life too.
Well, I was phobic about
you
drugs.
were?
Yeah, I never touched the stuff, really, for the record. No, I really.
Are you running for office?
I'm on this show to declare. Well, no. So you just start reading some of the stuff, especially from the '60s, about acid and LSD and this, and it's kind of. I think I was scared a little bit. And not to mention didn't understand some of it. But I had a French teacher at school, at collegiate school in Manhattan, who'd say sometimes when a kid was daydreaming in class, he'd say, you're listening to the music but not the lyrics. And I think that's what a lot of us did as kids, because some of the songs are, as someone in the book wrote, child-centric. I mean, Yellow Submarine and Octopus's Garden, I mean, they're playful.
That's right. There's no age line with the Beatles. And the whole... I mean, it's interesting because at this stage in my life, I seem to be going back through that kaleidoscopic period. The whole, this maybe hallucinogenics are opening the world. Maybe rationality is the enemy. I go now to a Buddhist group, and we're very, and so it was a phase that I passed through, but that those questions really weren't answered.
Right.
And the bad guys in my world have aligned themselves again with rationality and profit in a way that they seem to be aligned with it in 1967. Odd.
Yeah.
But we're coming around again. And also their biographies
Right.
turned out to be inescapably
Yeah.
our biography.
Well, I think a lot of people sort of saw in the bands the innocence and the youth and the purity and the young love and sexuality and everything else, and then sort of eventually revolution and then eventually the end. And the last piece in the book is two of us and sort of going their separate ways, but sort of paradoxically together, but separately. So I think even unconsciously, a lot of people kind of projected on to the band and some of the music and some of the songs their own lives.
Oh, lots of people did, and this is full of lots of good examples of that. I want, just because I always like to, I want you to read the first page and a half. If you want to wait, or do you want to do it now?
Whatever you want. No, I mean...
Why don't you read the first, down to the end of the last full graph on the second page of your brother's really, I think, wonderful.
My mon frère Pierre, who's one of the smartest people I know, and I call him Peterpedia because there just seems to be nothing he doesn't sort of have at his fingertips. But he is one of my two older brothers. The oldest brother was actually the manager of a band called the Cramps, and he's now a therapist, which, depending whom you ask, that's either a big leap or there's actually some kind of synergy there. But I just missed, because of my age, the Beatles. They were there. They were at Shea Stadium, I think, and I got some of my love for the Beatles from both of them. And this is a piece by Peter. My brother was a journalist, now writes novels, writes for TV. And it's about the song called "And Your Bird Can Sing."
And it's also about a terrific, or a tragic historic moment.
Well, that's right. So, I've lived in New York City my entire life, but on the night John Lennon was murdered, I was in a grubby little post-industrial ash heap of a Connecticut town, a newly minted adult working for a newspaper and trying to earn the right to call myself a writer. Early in the evening, I'd gone to watch a movie called Resurrection in an empty theater so that I could write a review probably no one would read about a film that almost no one would see. Then, feeling homesick, I went to the library and looked for copies of the Times and the Post. Why the place was open that late in a small town, I don't know. A few minutes after I got there, a homeless guy in a baseball cap with wings on the sides started screaming and banging on the glass doors. I went over to see what was wrong, and for no discernible reason, he punched me in the nose. I walked back to my rental apartment with a Budweiser in a bag and dried blood on my chin, and turned on Monday Night Football, trying to figure out if this was what grown-up life was about. The Patriots and the Dolphins were about to go into overtime. Then Howard Cosell came on and said that Lennon had just been shot twice in the back outside the Dakota apartment building on the Upper West Side and was dead at Roosevelt Hospital, which didn't make any sense either. Well, what could you do with that? A beloved musician shot dead in front of his home, assassinated in the city that helped to make his name on the Ed Sullivan Show and later at Shea Stadium. My hometown, which he'd adopted as his own. In the country he'd given solace to when a beloved president was assassinated 17 years before. Killed in a notoriously violent city by a visitor from beautiful Hawaii, an absurd end for one of the greatest of all absurdists.
You got a lot there in those paragraphs.
Well, there's a lot there, and that's kind of emblematic of. You might say, well, wait a second, this is supposed to be a book about writers writing about songs of the Beatles, and it's like a lot of book reviews, which you know about. Sometimes you don't get to the book that's being covered till the third, fourth, fifth paragraph because there's exposition.
I think sometimes there's too much of that. Sometimes there's too much of
Right.
that. You want to bring it close, but you don't want to use it as you don't want to use it. There's too much of that now, I think.
Well, sometimes the reviewer makes it about himself or herself,
That's
too.
right.
Whereas with some of these pieces, it's just kind of setting the scene and the stage. And
That's right.
Here's where I was in my head, in my life.
That's right.
And here's how this song came into it. And some of the writers write about you develop a relationship with a song, and sometimes that relationship changes over time.
And sometimes one of the other essays I really like is Alec Wilkinson's, and I'm mentioning it just to give satisfaction to people who think that the world is a corrupt little gang, because I really am friends with Alec Wilkinson.
Sure, right.
But he also is an excellent writer.
Well, Alec is a phenomenal writer, and I've had him in 2 or 3 of the other collections just because.
And the essay he wrote about She Said, talks about how that was emblematic of a phase of his life that was distinct kind of from the rest of his life. And that brings up a second question, which is that as I read this book, I felt like a man with his arms tied behind his back, because I thought I knew the songs, but I wasn't sure. I thought I knew what they were talking about, but I wasn't sure.
Right.
And then it turns out that I could take my telephone and for pennies, or even not for pennies, I guess if I wanted to use Spotify, I could listen to the songs.
Right.
So this is a book that I hope you don't mind. People should feel free. They should know now that we live in a world where if they miss a song and want to hear it, they can hear it.
Right.
Like within a minute.
Right.
There are lots of terrible things about our world we live in, but this is one of the wonderful ones.
And some people would argue sometimes you don't want to do that. And again, going back to Sgt. Pepper, it's the 50-year anniversary, and arguably it was the first so-called concept album. This is ostensibly a concept book. The methodology is it starts with the writers writing about the songs that the Beatles recorded at the inception and sort of takes you through the trajectory. So you see the kind of evolution, revolution, whatever to call it. So to take one song out of Sgt. Pepper, which was intended to be listened to sort of as everything being of a piece, but everything else kind of, sure, if you have a favorite song or you're reading a piece about a song and you're not familiar with it, then you're right, within seconds and for pennies you can be listening to it.
Yeah. No, I don't. That brings up the whole question of scholarship, and one of the unfortunate things scholarship can do is that it can close doors on people, and I don't think we should let it do that, right? I mean, the Beatles they belong to all of us now.
Well, they do, but maybe that speaks to something, because whether it's, my girlfriend and I have a 2.5-year-old toddler at home, and he wakes up some mornings and the first thing he says is see the Beatles, or, again, Octopus's Garden, and he thinks that's hilarious. And then I think there are graduate level courses being taught that you can get credit for, just to quote unquote study the Beatles. So what does that tell you? That it speaks to the transcendence. And when you think about, or when I think about how young they were, they'd be called, the word didn't exist then, that they were millennials, and that they were writing about emotions, with such a level of insight and maturity and resonance for so many people.
Do you know there's a guy who's making a movie out of every song. He's been at the Burns a couple of times. I wish I could remember his name, but it's fascinating. One of the great things about them is that they really worked hard. They were not dashing anything off ever.
Right.
They battled each other. They went through draft after draft after draft, and sometimes back to the first draft.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you get out of that's so joyous is that they were really a tribe, a friendship. Their friendship, the pleasure they were getting in that was a big part of their art.
Right.
And they were bigger than the sum of their parts.
Well, that's a great way to put it too. Yeah. And you can hear on some of the tracks that it was a decision not to edit it out. You can even hear them laughing, or you can just hear in their voices how much joy. And then in the end, things went a different way. But that's the way it goes with a lot of tribes, families, internal lives. And
with all of us as individuals as well.
Right, exactly.
But again, I don't want to bring that up.
Well, this sort of, are you more of a George or a John? It's also the same way people's favorite songs changes depending on where they are in their life.
Yes.
I think some people, Peter, my brother, actually goes on in that piece to say that, however it may sound, he actually thinks that Paul is underrated.
Yeah.
How much more rated could he be? And yet you sort of know what he's talking about.
Yes. Because he was kind of the coach. He brought them all together in a way. Although Lennon was the leader. It also changed all the time.
Right. Exactly.
It changed all the time. But it was it's beautiful to see the freedom they had, and this is going to alienate some people, but I just loved the Jon Stewart show when it was new, and we wants to see it being shot, and you could see what fun they were having. I mean, the real problem they were having is cutting out the laughter because they
Right.
They were
But
having fun.
that's odd, right? That it's become sort of verboten, or if you're
I
having
know.
fun doing something. I mean, I'm
It
an
has no
agent when I'm
value.
not doing these anthologies, and occasionally I have a author say, I'm done with the manuscript, and I actually had fun with it. And there's kind of a surprise, but also a guilt. And you're a writer, so you know what that's like. That there's the notion that was it Dorothy Parker who says, "I love having written, but I don't like writing." Or
Yeah,
something to that
and
effect.
not Rust Hills, but the great baseball writer said, writing is easy. You just sit and open a vein, a vein, and there's lots and lots of stuff about how awful.
But when you have to write for a living just to make your rent or whatever it is, that's one thing. These projects, enterprises, are almost always born of passion, of love, of conviction, because all these writers could be doing things that are a lot more lucrative, that are a lot more sort of on the road to something else, as opposed to.
And the commercialization, I think, of writing, the real commercial successes often grow out of passion, not out of a need to make money.
Well, that always triggers one of my all-time favorites. One of the only person in whose presence, no disrespect, in whose presence I've been awed. It was Charles Schultz of Peanuts fame, and if you know the backstory, he just wanted to make enough money to be able to continue to be a cartoonist and just do the next one. And Paul McCartney has a little introductory note in this book.
Yeah.
And I take him at his word that he just said, we just liked what we were doing. There's no aspiration or expectation that things would go anywhere near where they went.
But they did put in their time, all that time.
Sgt. Pepper was 700 hours in the studio. The notion was that they just sort of
whipped things on.
well, and the hair and the costume, how they affected the culture. But I think you're right.
They did this thing. I think some writers, some artists just are naturally beautiful. It's very rare, as it is in athletics. But when they get self-conscious, that's usually the end of their career. Yeah. Others go into self-consciousness and then battle through it, and I think that's what they did. They were acutely they couldn't not have been.
Right.
And so they went through, 27 drafts of every instrument in every song, and somehow they triumphed over the material.
And no small part of what you're talking about, I think, is attributable to George Martin, who was the famed, revered producer. Because again, they were
kids.
Young.
Yeah,
kids.
they were kids. Yeah. Anyway, they were a powerful, wonderful force in our life. Sometimes it makes me sad because I used to, like before we went into Iraq, I made my kids watch the movies, the Vietnam War movies, and I convinced myself that we weren't going to go into Iraq,
right?
Because it didn't make any sense if you just watched The Deer Hunter and Platoon.
Right.
You just think, why would you go to war?
Yeah.
And then into Iraq we went,
Right.
into Afghanistan, then into Iraq.
Right.
So there's this sadness that we've been given this wisdom,
Right.
and we've just
So how does
forgotten it.
And
We've forgotten it.
Oh.
Well,
that's
I mean, if we, hadn't turned our back on what the Beatles are about, we wouldn't be in the
I was
places we're
telling
in
you
now.
before we started, I was at the Kennedy Center in Washington last week for a tribute to John Lennon specifically, and the name of the event was Come Together. And
That's right.
well-
is that a national theme now?
yeah, well, would it ever be a bad time for that? But has there ever been a time we needed it more? But yeah, the sadness of, people obviously like to demonize Yoko, and this is why it ended, and as opposed to just, it was a 10-year run, basically, that ended in 1970, and here we are 47 years later, and I was playing sort of on a loop, different. It's just there's something for every mood, not for everyone maybe, but just, I've never grown tired of any of the songs, and I've heard them, so many of them, thousands of times. And why is that? I don't have the answer, but that's...
Well, the two nice things are that support a couple of my cherished and therefore probably mistaken theories.
Yeah.
One is that they worked very hard. They did work very hard. And the other is that they loved each other and were
Yeah.
enjoying the
Yeah.
process.
Yeah.
So if people go out, set out to make something, and they work very hard and they enjoy the process, even if they don't make a good song, that's
Right.
not a decade badly spent.
Right.
Whereas if they go out and what they really care about is the product, and they don't really like each other,
Right.
and they work and they cut corners, that's no good even if they do produce
Well,
a good
right.
song.
Right. I mean, as when I'm acting as an agent, and writers will sometimes say, "I want to write a book, but I don't know what to write about." You know, sort of what's selling now, or what. And I just think this is going nowhere
Yeah.
fast, or should, because the moment you start becoming demagogic and
But
trying to
it
give
goes
people
in your
what they
head.
want,
It lodges
You're right.
in your head as an older writer. I don't. I mean, I practically want to write, "Dear Reader, I don't care if you buy this book. I don't care if you."
right? But that
Get
can be
lost.
implicit without you actually saying it.
I know, but and also learning something is a disadvantage in a way that it never was. Like, I've spent almost 10 years now working on a book on dogs, so
Right.
I know a lot about dogs.
Right.
And this leads to me getting in quarrels with people.
Right.
Because they ask me a question about a dog and I can answer it.
Right.
They don't want the question answered.
What do they want?
They want their own. They want to come
They
to
want
their
validated.
own. They want their own position validated or their own way of life. So they'll say, "My dog barks." Well, I can fix that. Well,
Yeah.
what do you do? Well, you get this little gadget. Oh, I don't want to do that. Okay. Then your dog can bark. That's okay. Your dog can bark.
I mean, Bart Giamatti, I think, said, "Don't ever ask a question that you don't really want the answer to," which
Well,
sounds
peop-
obvious, but people do it all the
They
time.
ask questions all the time, and I'm there, right there. I'm going around with these service dogs, so I have a dog with me.
Right.
So they say, "You're a dog trainer?" "Yeah." And they say, "I have a problem." "Oh, I can fix that." "Oh,
Mm-hmm.
what's the problem?" "Well, my dog pees all over the rug." "Put it in a crate." "Oh, I can't put my dog in a crate."
Right, right, right. Yeah, I mean, either something speaks to your experience. I mean, in this case, so many to come back
Yeah.
to. I mean, I think part of the reason there's so much connection to the music and to the songs is because you talk about Alec Wilkinson. I think his song that he wrote about "She Said, She Said" it spoke to him. David Duchovny wrote a piece about Dear Prudence, which I think will surprise a lot of people who just know him as this actor.
Star,
He's
yeah.
a great writer, very introspective. Like as with some of the other books, whether it was about Central Park or others that we've talked about, it does circle back to being about family a lot of the time.
A lot of it's about family, and at least at our stage in life, a lot of it's about childhood, right?
A lot of it's about childhood, and if not your own, then
Suppose
it's.
Freud was onto something.
I mean, Alan Light, who has, I think, the second piece in the book, writes about "I saw her standing there," and sort of. It's so touching to me. I mean, it's the one that, for whatever reason, engendered the most emotion from me reading it, even the second or third time, because it's about him sort of passing his love on to his son, and his son who now performs, some of the songs. He's still a teenager, I think. So,
And there's the Mona Simpson, who I don't think she writes. Does she write badly? Is there stuff I've seen that she wrote
no,
that's bad?
Mona's-
That she's.
No, she's.
I just
from-
thought, oh, this is going to be a good one, and at the end, it's about the song, and then she just drops herself into it. She says,
Well, that's right.
"I'm not the runaway."
Well, no, the first thing I read of Mona's was years ago. Was I think Anywhere But Here.
Yes.
I mean, part of what I like and love about putting these
Yeah.
books together is there are some sort of relatively obvious people you try to get or go to, Roseanne Cash or
Yeah.
Chuck Klosterman.
Yeah.
But then the surprising people, and
Yeah.
Mona, why would you think Mona Simpson? Well, I didn't know, but you don't know until you ask. And she writes, again, talking about the music and the lyrics, I had heard She's Leaving Home for sure 1,000 times in my life. But until I read her piece, it's not that I couldn't understand, I just hadn't really thought what it's, listened to the lyrics closely enough to understand what it's about. And it's beautiful, and it's touching, and
Yes.
it's sad, and in the end, ultimately, it's personal.
Yeah, they are all ultimately, a lot of them generational, some of them about their grandchildren listening to the music. Make a really good point about it being, them being child friendly, I mean, they're not Raffi, but they're,
Well, there's child there's child as in, again, the little Sam we have at home, who's literally 2.5, and we're playing every time in Octopus's Garden. It came on the other day, and he just cracked up because he knows what an octopus is now, and he just thought, an Octopus's Garden? That's silly. But then others, it's just kind of, they're relatable, even if you're a child. I mean, again, whether it's Alec, who was kind of this very kind of introspective, quiet kid but he found music. And I asked Alec, one, because I knew him and loved his work from the New Yorker. I mean, one of the criticisms of some of these books, this one maybe too will be in for this, is it reads like a special edition of the New Yorker, as if like that's a bad thing. It happens, a lot of the best writing comes from people who write for the New Yorker, including Alec, who I knew sort of somewhere in our past, loved music and played a little bit himself.
Yeah,
so.
That's right, yeah. But there are, I don't know, there are many good essays in this. And I'm going to say a thing that your publisher, I'm sure, will object to. But I wanted to say, the first book I did was the book of my father's letters.
Right.
And I wanted to put in the introduction, because I'd done this whole thing where I set it all up and made a story out of it and put a lot of extra information in. And I said, you may want to read the whole book. God bless you if you do. Oh. But if you don't, you can just leaf through and eat and read a letter or two, like you might eat a potato chip out of the bowl. There's no need. And the publisher said, "Oh, well, they're paying $29.95. You got to."
Right.
But there's no need to read the whole book. You want them to read the whole.
No, I understand what you're saying. I'm thinking about the contributors as potato chips, but that's I think if it's a high quality quality chip.
No, I didn't mean that.
No, I get it completely. And in fact, I wouldn't disagree with you that if people look at this list of 28 writers, some of whose names they'll know and want to read, I want to read Adam Gopnik's piece or John Hockenberry's. Others, you can look through the list of songs that are written about.
That's right.
But there's no disrespect. Again, it's a concept book in a way because there's a trajectory, but absolutely, it's part of the treat is being able to jump in. And collections in general, the industry, collections are not frowned upon, but stigmatized. Because the notion, fallacious as it is that people, if they're going to spend $25 for a hardcover, they want a story, they get characters, they get immersed in. Well, you have a story here and characters, but the reality of people's lifestyles and time they have for reading, it's a little bit the subway here before bed. I mean, so you can get a wholly satisfying experience.
We have to be a little honest about books, which is that people don't buy them that much, and those who do may not read the whole thing, and you ought to have a way to make peace with the fact that you're going to buy a book because it's very hard to get information that's not slanted, or that's not, in which the slant is not discernible. So in other words, it's very hard to get information that's not going to influence you in ways you don't have control.
Well, isn't that emblematic of, I mean, if you watch MSNBC, you're getting, if you watch Fox, I mean, where is the kind of neutral, objective, it's becoming less
But
clear.
You're much more apt to get in prose and poetry an original voice, not commercialized, and that should be precious. And that should be precious if you spend 20 minutes with a book or if you spend 8 hours with it.
Well, it's fun. I'm just thinking, just because we're talking about books and music, it used to, even when I was a kid, it's sort of like you'd hear something on the radio and you'd fall in love with it. And you'd say, if it wasn't the Beatles, somebody was a known quantity. And then you'd be torn, or should I get the whole album? Because if everything else or anything else is as good as this one song, and sometimes you buy the album and what you heard on the radio, that was it. But then you had the option of buying the 45, the single, and I have a collection in storage.
Do you?
Yeah. But that, again, the difference being they're in storage because, one, they're vinyl, and two, I played those probably 1,000 times and then never wanted to hear them again because they were just sort of top 40 bubblegum, kind of chew it up, versus this, which is just, it really is phenomenological.
Yeah, it is. They are who they are, and nobody else was them, and we got to see their happiness and their tragedies and their.
But it's interesting too how people get animated about their animus in a way toward them. Again, sometimes if they're Rolling Stones fans and they think you're talking about dog, the myth is that you're a dog person or you're a cat person, and you have to choose one or the other, and never the twain shall meet. I don't know, was it Mick Jagger or one of the Stones said, the Beatles, they're a nice little band. you
Well,
know,
that's okay for them to say that because it's all part of entertainment. I think they're grossly mistaken. But
Right,
it's-
right.
it's but also, I mean, the big problem goes under the subtitle, identity politics. People now, and I don't know why it is, but they feel insecure about their identity and they want it expressed in their car, in their toothpaste, in their music, and they don't expect a contradiction. And contradictions are not widely accepted, and that's absurd.
Right.
That's just absurd.
I mean, it's kind of like there's a study for everything, right? But if I'm remembering it correctly, there was some study that showed Republicans were more likely to, if they had to choose the favorite Beatle, it would be more likely to be Paul. Democrats was more John, and Independents was, George. I mean, is that about identity politics? Is that about persona and projection that Paul?
Well, that's more subtle, I think, than if you vote for a Democrat, you can't hunt or fish, that kind of stuff,
Right.
which is silly. Anyway, it's a wonderful book, and what's the better simile for potato chip? A pistachio, which we know is full of magnesium and calcium, or walnuts, which are good for you.
Yeah.
So if you think of it as a bowl of pistachio nuts,
Each one different from the other.
each one different from the other, and excellent, lots of different excellent writers, different voices, and not as they are in the New Yorker, not tamed to a certain chorus, but playing their own particular songs and
Right,
styles.
right.
And thank you for doing it.
Thank you for having me.